This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. The headlines. North Korea's leader speaks of a warm climate of reconciliation with the South after delegation returns from the Winter Olympics. Jacob Zuma is reportedly told by his own party to resign as South Africa's president within 48 hours.
I'm Sharon Gilale in London, also on the programme. Surviving in the big smoke, with more than half the world's population living in cities, we look at how urban life across Asia can be made better. And dodging the dogs in India, fear on the streets where thousands die every year from rabies bites.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Glad you could join us. It's 9 in the morning here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London, and 9:30 in the morning in Pyongyang, where the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has praised South Korea as very impressive. According to state media, Kim Jong-un also expressed satisfaction and gratitude after his sister and other top regime officials returned from a landmark visit to the South from the Winter Olympic Games. Let's get the very latest now from our correspondent, Stephen McDonald in Seoul. And Stephen, this seems to be a very optimistic sign.
Well, for those who would want greater dialogue between North and South Korea, it's definitely an optimistic sign. It's not every day you get the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, praising the South. Normally he's talking about what, they're puppets of the US imperialists and this type of thing, and instead we hear him saying that South Korea is very impressive. Now, this all came in the form of a report from North Korea's state-run media, which said the North Korean delegation returned from the South Korean Winter Olympics and reported back. And that he was after hearing that report, was very impressed. He especially said he was impressed that the North Koreans were prioritised here and treated well, and called for the North and South Korea ties to be even warmer. So it does seem that the thaw is on, if you like. These people will remember, just a few days ago, he sent a personal message, a handwritten message, to the leader of South Korea inviting him to visit the North. We've not heard yet whether the South Korean leader is going to do that. I think he doesn't want to just say, automatically I'll go. There have to be some conditions. And yet there we have also the US side, and we're not even sure what's going on with them in terms of these conflicting reports about their preparedness to speak to the North.
All right, it seems like they're more open to speaking with the North, and the Trump administration is seeing this rather closeness between the North and the South developing.
Yes, we saw this report from the Washington Post saying that US Vice President Mike Pence had told a reporter on board Air Force Two on his way back from the Winter Olympics that the Trump administration would consider an initial meeting with the North without preconditions. And people heard this report and thought, well, it's on. And yet then we have Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, coming out following that and saying, well, in not so clear terms, that North Korea has to do certain things in terms of talks going ahead. So it's pretty uncertain what the actual position of the Trump administration is in terms of its preparedness to speak to North Korea.
Thank you so much for updating us from Seoul, Stephen McDonald.
Well, let's take a look now at some of the day's other news. And South Africa's President Jacob Zuma has been given 48 hours to resign. And top officials from the governing ANC are discussing the future of the president, who is under pressure to quit over corruption allegations. Local media have reported a late-night visit by the party's new head, Cyril Ramaphosa, to Mr. Zuma's house to deliver an ultimatum. BBC's Milton Nkosi is in Pretoria for us.
What we now know is that since we've been here, the president of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, drove out and he went to President Jacob Zuma's official residence, Mahlamba Ndlovu, and when he arrived there, there was some delay at the gate. They said it was too late, but eventually they were let in. And after a very brief period, the convoy returned back here. And they were still talking, I suppose at that time he had been coming back with the response for President Zuma on whether he will voluntarily resign or whether he will be forced to be recalled, probably through an impeachment process in Parliament. And that would be a humiliation that Cyril Ramaphosa had said publicly he's trying to avoid. Remember that President Zuma still commands considerable political support in rural areas, in particular here in South Africa. He's an anti-apartheid struggle hero. He spent 10 years behind bars on Robben Island alongside Nelson Mandela, fighting colonialism and white minority rule. These corruption allegations that have brought us here today have been hanging over him for well over a decade now, and his own party has been calling for him to step down. It now looks like he is left with no other option but to concede to the calls of his own party, the African National Congress, which is the oldest liberation movement on the African continent, and to respect its own wishes for him to step down, just as they did with Thabo Mbeki, his predecessor, in 2008. Now South Africans are waiting to hear whether President Zuma has agreed to step down.
Milton Nkosi there. Also making news today, President Trump has promised what he's calling the biggest and boldest infrastructure investment in American history. Now, announcing the plans as part of his new budget, he said he wanted to create thousands of jobs, building roads, ports, as well as airports. The proposal is for some $1.5 trillion of investment, but only $200 billion will come from public funds. And last Friday, Reuters published an extensive report into the killing of 10 Rohingya men in September, including this photograph and eyewitness accounts. Now, while working on the story, 2 of the agency's journalists were arrested and now face up to 14 years in prison. A longtime friend of Aung San Suu Kyi is the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Bill Richardson. He's been speaking to my colleague Katty Kay about what happened to the Reuters journalists.
When I asked her, I said, with these 2 specific journalists, why are they being detained? They were doing their job. They've discovered possibly some mass graves. She exploded at me. She was not willing to listen to frank advice, even from her friends. We go back 30 years. And the situation, Katty, is getting worse. There's 1 million refugees in Bangladesh that want to go home, but the repatriation process is not working. There are killings, there are rapes, there are massive degradation of human rights. This is an international crisis that the international community needs to respond to.
Oxfam's Deputy Chief Executive has resigned over the handling of a sex scandal involving aid workers. The British charity is accused of concealing the findings of an inquiry into claims staff used prostitutes while delivering aid in Haiti in 2011. Penny Lawrence said she took full responsibility. And a happy ending for a terrier named Charlie, who was pulled to safety after a 72-hour rescue operation in the Scottish Highlands. Now, Charlie, who looks far more relieved here, he was treated to a steak pie after his ordeal and is doing well, according to his owner. And today marks 10 years since the national apology to Australia's Indigenous communities for the grief and loss they suffered over many generations, including the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. A new report shows the social gap between Aboriginal Australians and others is still wide, with progress in 4 out of 7 key areas not on target. Howell Griffith is outside Parliament for us. Howell, how is it being commemorated?
So we're seeing events across Australia today. 10 years to the day since an apology was delivered in Parliament there. 10 years ago there were thousands of people on this lawn to witness the moment. But a decade on, many people asking just how much progress has been made. As you said in that report, some startling findings, the difference in life expectancy, for example, or the employment rate still significant. To discuss some of those things, I'm joined now by Richard Weston, who's from the Healing Foundation. You were actually set up 10 years ago to try and address some of those lasting issues. But take me back 10 years ago. What's your memory of the apology and the impact that it had?
I think the impact was enormous for the nation. For the first time, Stolen Generation story was properly acknowledged, and it was done in such an amazing way where our Prime Minister stood up in the National Parliament and it was broadcast across the country live on television, and he said those amazing words. He said sorry, and he apologised for the atrocities of the past. He made apologies specifically to the Stolen Generations and for their hurt, their pain and the trauma that they've had to endure. So it was a time of great hope, I think, and that finally Australia was ready to right the wrongs of the past. But as you say, 10 years down the track, there's still a long way to go.
How much of that hope is left? I mean, an apology is significant, but what about action?
Look, in itself, the apology is still an amazing occurrence, but you're right. There hasn't been enough progress against the government's main policy, which has been to close the gap, and that's the life expectancy gap between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. And we had a report from the Prime Minister yesterday, which he does annually to the Parliament, and he reports on a number of targets. There's 7 targets to close the gap, and we're only on track in 3 of them to achieve those outcomes.
Now, you work with Stolen Generation survivors, Indigenous communities across Australia. How engaged are they in this process? Because the government says it's doing everything it can, but it needs Indigenous communities to work with them. How much will is there to work with the government?
Look, I've been working with the Foundation for 8 years. Our role is to tackle trauma and support healing in our communities. And everywhere I go around Australia, people want to see change. They want to address the disadvantage in their communities, and there's plenty of leadership at that grassroots level. Last year we had a gathering of Indigenous people at Uluru who issued a statement for constitutional recognition, but the guts of that statement is about work with us. Don't do things to us, do them with us, work in partnership, and we'll help you close the gap and we can achieve some better life outcomes for Aboriginal people in this country.
Richard Weston from the Healing Foundation, thank you. The Foundation will be holding a concert on the lawns of the Parliament this evening, one of many events being held to commemorate the anniversary, but as you can see, there are still some major issues to be tackled.
Colwell Griffiths there outside Parliament in Canberra. You're watching Newsday on the BBC, live from London and Singapore. Still to come on the program. Surviving in the big smoke with more than half the world's population living in cities, we look at how urban life across Asia can be made better. Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Sharon Jitlale in London. Our top stories. North Korea's leader speaks of a warm climate of reconciliation with the South after a delegation returns from the Winter Olympics.
South African President Jacob Zuma has been told by his own party that he has 48 hours to resign. London's Heathrow Airport has set a duty-free promotion at the weekend where Chinese customers were asked to spend more than non-Chinese customers to receive the same discount was unacceptable. This story is popular on BBC.com. Let's now take a look at some of the front pages from around the world, and we start off with the international edition of the Japan Times, and it leads with Vice President Mike Pence's suggestion that he would be open to holding talks with North Korea without preconditions. The paper questions whether we're seeing a significant shift in the Trump administration's approach to Pyongyang. The Singapore Straits Times leads with a surge in tourism from China into the city-state. It's made China the #1 source of tourism revenue for the city, a post previously held by Indonesia. And finally, the China Daily takes a look at Xi Jinping's visit to a space launch center in Sichuan province. The Chinese president ordered the center to focus on boosting the country's space program. The week-long World Urban Forum concludes today in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the event is dedicated to the idea that managing cities properly is the key to sustainable development. This comes at a time when 54% of the world's population lives in cities, and that percentage is only expected to grow. And the work done in cities make up 80% of the global economy. But the impact is not all positive. Large cities also create 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions, giving urban areas a crucial role in fighting climate change. And not everyone benefits equally as more and more people move to the cities. There are nearly 900 million people still living in slums, highlighting the pressing need for affordable housing. Let's cross over now to our reporters to see what problems they're encountering in cities across the region.
China has urbanized at a staggering rate over the last 30 years. It's pushed about a third of its population into mega cities, and this is the most mega of those cities. Shanghai, about 24 million people live here. One of the big downsides to that is this. There's traffic everywhere. Have a look at the congestion up there. At times, the network here is sclerotic. Now, what are the causes of that? Well, as China's got richer, it's cool to own a car. It's a status symbol. And also, there's so many people here coming to work, coming to school and going home all at the same time. Now, the government's tried to deal with that with public transport. It has a metro system that's expanding by the year, and it's very cheap, just 50 cents for a basic journey. It's also auctioning new license plates for cars, $10,000 to get some on the road. But the bottom line is, it's cool to own a car in this country, and that's showing no sign of changing.
Here in India's financial capital, Mumbai, affordable housing is a big challenge. Behind me across this railway line is Dharavi, which is Asia's largest slum. It's estimated that more than 40% of Mumbai's 21 million population lives in slums. Now, Mumbai is surrounded by water on 3 sides, making it difficult for the city to expand. Adding to the pressure is the fact that growing employment opportunities in the city is attracting migrants from other parts of India. Due to huge demand, real estate prices have been rising steadily over the last few decades, making formal housing unaffordable for most migrants in the city.
Jakarta, the mega city of Indonesia, is predicted to be sinking faster than any other city on the planet. In some places, predicted to be sinking up to 2 inches every year. And that means when there's a heavy, typical monsoon rainfall in the hills behind Jakarta, many areas flood. Less than half of the people living here in Jakarta have access to clean, piped drinking water. Most people rely on things like this, a pump that's drawing up the groundwater to get access to clean drinking water. But the underground water supplies are not being replenished because most of Jakarta is now covered by concrete and asphalt. The waterways that flow through Jakarta are some of the most polluted rivers in the world, filled with plastic and other household waste. This builds up, creating plastic dams and makes the flooding worse. The government is now conducting a massive clean-up of these waterways, but the task is huge. Observers say the city desperately needs more green spaces to absorb the rainwater. And observers say that to stop the sinking, this city has to stop drilling wells. And the government therefore needs to provide the millions of citizens that call this city home clean, reliable, piped drinking water. Rebecca Henschke, BBC News, Jakarta.
Jason Pomeroy is an award-winning architect and an expert in sustainable urban design. I asked him, how do we begin to address all these problems?
When you think about the fact that since 2007, half the world's population has been living in city centres, by 2050 that's going to increase by 75% of people will be living in inner city centres. Congestion, pollution, crime, these are some of the key issues that we're kind of facing. I think what we're seeing in Southeast Asian and Asian cities is a greater drive towards greener, smarter, more sustainable city environments.
But how do you integrate these smart city concepts into cities that are highly urbanized and populated?
Well, with a lot of difficulty, I say. I would say that if we take the first generation smart city, for instance, Songdo, or even other cities like Shenzhen, what we see is that there is a great wealth of knowledge, a shared intelligence, where people want to actually create startup companies that will actually help bring people from the slums and kind of give them jobs and give them kind of a better place to live. What we're seeing is that in these first generation smart cities, there has been that kind of opportunity for people to grow within the cities.
So that's Smart 1.0.
That's the 1.0.
What about the 2.0?
Right. The 2.0 city is when we start to see that, well, if the first generation was all about big companies, big infrastructure, technology and the economy, very top-down government-driven, the second generation is all about the people power. It's all about kind of what's in it for me. What's in it for my culture? What's in it for me on the street?
What about the third generation?
The third generation then starts to balance the environmental aspects. We are all aware of COP21, the climate change agenda, trying to kind of keep a lid on temperature rising. What we see is a greater embrace of greenery, open spaces, for the greater good of man as well as the environment.
But can these three generations of smart cities be embraced by Asian cities?
They can indeed. I mean, it's almost like looking at it like a layer cake. And what we see in fantastic examples like Bandung is that it is able to kind of, first of all, have a legislative structure. For instance, Ridwan Kamil, the mayor, has basically said, look, as long as we can actually set up an administration that would allow you to kind of tell me your problems through, say, Twitter or Facebook, we will then be able to sift through those issues to find out and root out that problem, and we'll fix it for you.
But the bottom line is political will and partnerships between the private and public sector.
Yes. I mean, you've got the public, the private sector, but I would argue that also you need academia and the private corporation. If these four spheres of influence are working together, that's when you get a great, smart, sustainable city.
And that was Jason Pomerol speaking to Rico earlier. Now, a third of all rabies deaths worldwide occur in India, according to the World Health Organization. If untreated, a bite from a rabid dog is almost always fatal. So why isn't India doing more to tackle the problem? Well, here's our South Asia correspondent, Justin Rolat.
It is 8 o'clock at night, and this is the main shopping street in Leh. Leh is the capital of a Himalayan region in the north of India. Now, normally you would expect a street like this to be fairly busy. Now, it is winter, but there's another reason why this place is so quiet, and that is that lots of people here in Leh are simply too frightened to come out. And that is because Leh has a really serious problem with stray dogs. At least 180 people were bitten by dogs last year. One man was mauled to death. Now, I want to get an idea of the scale of the problem, so we're out here looking to see how many dogs we can find, and just to be on the safe side, I've brought a stick. There's obviously some dogs down here. Let's go and have a look. There are estimated to be 30 million stray dogs in India. Huge numbers of people are bitten. One estimate is that as many as 15 million people could be bitten each year. And an indicator of just how serious that is are the World Health Organization's statistics on rabies. 20,000 people a year die of rabies here in India. That is a third of the world total.
Here. There's a ton up here.
Everywhere you go in the city, you hear this. You just hear dogs barking. They're all over the place. And this is a problem across India, and it's really, really difficult to solve. One of the reasons why is because there is a law against killing feral dogs. Now, there have been attempts at vaccinating them and sterilising them, but it simply hasn't been working. And until a solution can be found, the streets of Indian cities will continue to be very dangerous.
And that was Justin Rolat reporting. And you've been watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Stay with us. The problem of plastic polluting our oceans. Now, some companies are being creative with new initiatives to combat waste. That's coming up shortly.
And before we go, let's take a look at this. The official portraits of former U.S. President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle have been unveiled in Washington. Mr. Obama described his likeness as pretty sharp, while Mrs. Obama simply said, wow. That portrait gallery's tradition of commissioning presidential portraits began with President George H.W. Bush. And that's it from us.